I've been a park ranger for almost 7 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything. Wildfires, lost hikers, even a few close calls with mountain lions. But nothing could have prepared me for Pine Hollow. The first thing you notice when you arrive in Pine Hollow is the silence. It's not the peaceful kind of quiet, like when the wind dies down and all you can hear is the rustle of leaves. It's an oppressive silence, one that presses down on your shoulders and seeps into your bones, the kind that makes you feel like you're being watched. I was assigned to Pine Hollow last month. It's a remote part of the Rocky Mountains, miles away from any real civilization. The nearby town, Fairview, is small, more of a pit stop than a destination. You pass through it on the way to the national park. Maybe grab a coffee at the diner or stock up on supplies at the general store. The locals are friendly enough, but they keep their distance, especially when they find out you're heading into Pine Hollow. It didn't take long before I started hearing the stories. The people in Fairview all have their own versions of the legend, but they boil down to the same thing. Children used to go missing in the woods. A lot of children. The disappearances started in the early 1900s, when the town was still young and no one ever found out what happened to the kids. Some say the forest swallowed them up. Others say something worse, something ancient, took them. Of course, I didn't believe any of it. I've heard my fair share of ghost stories over the years, and they all follow the same formula. A little mystery, a little fear, all designed to keep people from wandering too far into the wilderness. As a ranger, you learn to filter out the folklore and focus on the facts. Still, there was something about Pine Hollow that made me uneasy, even from the start. The ranger station where I'm posted isn't much to look at. A small wooden cabin built decades ago, nestled at the edge of the hollow. There's a single room with a bed, a desk, and a tiny kitchen. The windows are old, the kind that fog up on cold mornings, and the walls creak whenever the wind blows through the trees. The place has character, I guess you could say, but it's also got a certain weight to it, a heaviness that I can't quite explain. Rachel, one of the other rangers, checks in with me once a day. She's stationed closer to the main part of the park, about 10 miles from Pine Hollow, where most of the tourists tend to stick. We don't get many visitors out here. The terrain is rough, and the stories about the missing children keep most people away. Rachel's been a ranger longer than I have, and she knows the park like the back of her hand. She's always been the calm, rational type, but even she seems uneasy when we talk about Pine Hollow. "You settling in okay?" she asked during one of our check-ins over the radio, her voice crackling through the static. "No strange noises keeping you up at night?" I laughed, but it came out a little too forced. "Nope, just the usual sounds of the wind and the trees. Haven't seen any ghosts yet, if that's what you're asking." Rachel chuckled, but there was a pause before she responded. "Just stay sharp, Sam. Pine Hollow's different. The locals aren't just spouting off old ghost stories. There's something about that place. You'll see." I didn't say anything to that. I didn't want to admit that I'd already felt it. The strange, oppressive silence. The way the trees seemed to loom over me as if they were watching. But I chalked it up to nerves. I hadn't been out here long enough to get comfortable yet. That was all. It was my 4th night at the station when I first heard the laughter. I'd just finished a patrol around the perimeter, checking the trails and making sure everything was in order. The moon was out, casting long shadows through the trees, and the air was colder than usual for early autumn. I was sitting at my desk, writing up the day's report, when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched giggle drifting through the open window. I stopped writing, my pen hovering over the page, and listened. It was so soft, I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again. Laughter. Children's laughter. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the dark forest. The moonlight illuminated the clearing outside the station, but there was no one there. The trees were still, the wind barely a whisper, but the laughter, it was still there, faint but unmistakable, like kids playing hide-and-seek just out of sight. My first thought was that Maybe a group of campers had wandered into the area. It wasn't common, but it happened from time to time. But the more I listened, the more I realized how wrong it sounded. The laughter didn't belong here. It was too distant, too echoey, as if the sound was coming from somewhere deep in the woods, carried on the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The laughter stopped the moment my boots hit the ground. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. I shined my flashlight into the trees, searching for any sign of movement, but the woods were empty, just the shadows of the branches swaying in the moonlight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. "Is someone out there?" Nothing, only the wind and the rustling of leaves. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, but I didn't see anything. Finally, I turned and went back inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. I didn't hear the laughter again, but I didn't sleep either. The next morning, I told myself it was just my imagination. The mind can play tricks on you when you're alone in a place like Pine Hollow. It was probably just the wind, or maybe an animal in the distance that sounded like a child. That's what I told myself anyway. But as I set out on my morning patrol, the unease lingered. The woods seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but that strange, heavy silence still hung in the air. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, checking the markers and making sure the path was clear. It was a routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw the first carving. It was on an old pine tree just off the trail. At first, I thought it was just natural wear and tear, but as I got closer, I saw it for what it was. A small, childlike figure scratched into the bark. The lines were rough, almost crude, but there was no mistaking it. It was a person, a child, with thin arms and legs and a round head. And the eyes, two deep gouges where the eyes should have been. I stared at it for a long time, running my fingers over the grooves. It looked old, like it had been there for years, but something about it felt recent, fresh. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees, but the forest was empty. I found another carving a few minutes later, farther down the trail, then another. They were all the same, small, crude figures with hollow eyes, etched into the bark of trees at irregular intervals. There had to be a dozen of them, maybe more. The farther I walked, the more I found. By the time I made it back to the station, my unease had turned to full-blown dread. That night, the laughter returned. I was sitting at my desk again, trying to write up my report, but my mind kept wandering back to the carvings. Who had made them? And why? It didn't feel like some random vandalism. There was a pattern to it, a purpose. The laughter started softly, barely audible at first, but it grew louder as the night wore on. I stood up, gripping the edge of the desk, my heart pounding in my chest. It sounded closer this time, almost right outside the window. I didn't go to the window. I didn't want to know what was out there. The next morning, I woke up with a knot of dread in my chest. The laughter from the night before still echoed in my mind, and no matter how hard I tried to brush it off, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me like a thick fog. The forest outside the station looked the same as always, but there was a strange heaviness to the air, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I set out on my morning patrol, hoping the fresh air and sunlight would help clear my head. It was the same routine as always. Follow the trail, check the markers, make sure everything was in order. But as I walked deeper into the forest, my thoughts kept drifting back to the carvings I'd found the day before. Those strange, crude figures etched into the bark of the trees. I told myself they were just old markings, maybe left behind by kids or campers from years ago. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. As I reached the spot where I'd found the first carving, I stopped and knelt down to examine the tree again. The figure was still there, small, childlike, its hollow eyes staring back at me. It hadn't changed, but there was something different about the forest today. The trees seemed closer, more menacing. I shook my head, trying to snap myself out of it. "It's just your imagination," I muttered under my breath. "You're letting the stories get to you." But as I stood up and turned to continue down the trail, I froze. There was another carving. This one was on a tree just a few feet away from the first, but it was slightly different. The figure was smaller, and the lines were even more jagged and crude. I took a step back, scanning the trees around me. More carvings. They were everywhere. Dozens of them, all scattered across the forest, like some kind of eerie breadcrumb trail. The figures seemed to multiply with each step I took, their hollow eyes following me as I moved. A chill ran down my spine. I reached for my radio, my hand trembling slightly as I clicked the button to call Rachel. "Rachel, you there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. A crackle of static, followed by her voice. "Yeah, I'm here. What's up?" "I found something strange out here. There are carvings in the trees. Do you know anything about that?" There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear Rachel frowning in confusion. "Carvings? What kind of carvings?" "Figures. They look like children. It's hard to explain, but there's a lot of them. They're all over the place." Rachel was quiet for a moment before responding. "I've heard of people carving stuff into trees before, but nothing like that. Maybe it's just some old markings from hikers or kids messing around." "I don't think so," I said, my voice low. "There's too many of them, and they're all the same. It feels like someone or something is leaving a message." Another pause, then Rachel spoke again, this time with a hint of concern in her voice. "You want me to come out there and take a look?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted her to come, to have someone else see what I was seeing, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But another part of me, an instinct I couldn't quite explain, told me it was better if I handled this alone. "No, it's fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'll keep an eye on it and let you know if anything else happens." "All right," Rachel said, though I could tell she wasn't convinced. "But stay safe, Sam, and if you need anything, call me." "I will." I clicked off the radio and continued down the trail, the weight of the carvings heavy on my mind. I spent the rest of the day patrolling the forest, but no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the carvings. They were everywhere, like they'd sprung up overnight, multiplying in the shadows. Each one seemed to be staring at me, their hollow eyes following my every move. By the time I made it back to the ranger station, the sun was already starting to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. I couldn't stop thinking about the carvings, about how unnatural they felt. That night, I sat at my desk, staring at the radio, debating whether or not to call Rachel again. But before I could make up my mind, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. On the edge of my desk, half buried under a pile of old papers, was a photograph. I frowned, pulling the photo free and holding it up to the light. It was an old black and white picture, yellowed with age, showing a group of children standing in front of the ranger station. They looked young, no more than 6 or 7 years old, dressed in old-fashioned clothes that seemed to belong to another era. Their faces were blank, unsmiling, their eyes dark and shadowed. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. In the background, standing just behind the children, was a man. And that man was me. I dropped the photo like it had burned me, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't make sense. The photo was clearly from a long time ago. But there I was, standing among the children, dressed in my current ranger uniform, staring blankly at the camera. My hands shook as I picked up the photo again, searching for some kind of explanation. Maybe the man just looked like me. But the more I stared at it, the more certain I became. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was me. I stood up, pacing the small cabin, trying to calm the rising panic in my chest. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of joke, some trick. But who would go to such lengths to mess with me out here? The laughter started again, soft and distant, floating through the air like a taunt. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was closer this time, more insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and threw open the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The laughter stopped as soon as I stepped outside. The clearing was empty, just like the night before. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their branches casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. I shined my flashlight into the woods, scanning the trees for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, only silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the forest remained still, watching, waiting. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. That night I barely slept. The next morning I made a decision. I was going to find out what was going on in Pine Hollow, no matter what it took. The carvings, the laughter, the photograph, it all pointed to something I couldn't ignore. I needed answers. But the more I searched, the more I felt like I was being led somewhere. The carvings grew more frequent, the laughter more persistent. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees shifting, bending, guiding me deeper into the hollow. And no matter how far I walked, no matter which path I took, I always ended up back in the same spot. A small clearing surrounded by trees, with a circle of worn, decaying children's shoes scattered across the ground. I stood in that clearing, my flashlight beam flickering over the scattered shoes. They were old, decayed, worn down by time and the elements. Tiny shoes meant for children, arranged in a circle like some kind of ritual offering. My breath caught in my throat as the wind picked up, swirling through the clearing, stirring the shoes until they began to shift and turn, as though something invisible was moving them. Each shoe, slowly but deliberately, pointed toward a deeper part of the woods. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shoes couldn't have moved on their own. There had to be a logical explanation. But the wind, the way it had picked up so suddenly, like it was directing me, like it was guiding me deeper into Pine Hollow, it didn't feel natural. Nothing about this place felt natural anymore. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around and run back to the station, to lock the door behind me and pretend none of this was happening. But some invisible force, kept pulling me forward. A curiosity mixed with fear, a need to understand what was happening in these woods. I took a step toward the direction the shoes were pointing, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching for me. The air grew colder, heavier, as though the forest itself was alive, breathing down my neck. The farther I went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the wind, the rustling leaves, even my own footsteps seemed to vanish into the void. It was as if the world had been swallowed by silence, leaving me alone in the dark, surrounded by the oppressive weight of the forest. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to lose its meaning in that place. The path twisted beneath my feet, the trees growing denser and more tangled. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving between the trees, a flicker of pale skin darting just out of sight. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the endless, suffocating silence. Eventually, I found myself standing in another clearing, smaller than the first, but just as unsettling. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat rock, and etched into its surface were more of those crude figures, children with hollow eyes and stick-thin limbs. They seemed to dance across the stone, their arms reaching toward each other in some kind of twisted, childlike game. I knelt down to examine the carvings, my fingers tracing the lines etched into the rock. They felt old, ancient, like they had been there for centuries. But something about them felt wrong. The figures were too familiar, too deliberate. It was as if whoever or whatever had carved them was trying to send a message. I stood up, backing away from the rock, my skin prickling with unease. That's when I noticed the shoes. They were scattered around the edges of the clearing, just like before. But this time, they weren't pointing anywhere. They were simply there, lying in the dirt, half buried beneath fallen leaves, as if they had been left behind long ago. A chill ran down my spine, and I turned to leave. But when I looked back at the path I had come from, it was gone. The trees had shifted, closing in around the clearing, twisting and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the path remained obscured, swallowed by the forest. Panic surged through me. I spun around, searching for any sign of the trail, any familiar landmark. But there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of trees, their branches swaying in the cold wind. I was trapped. I stumbled back toward the center of the clearing, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The shoes seemed to mock me, their silent presence a reminder that I wasn't alone. Something was here, something watching, waiting. I reached for my radio, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the dial. Rachel? Rachel, are you there? Static crackled through the speaker, followed by Rachel's voice, faint and distant. Sam, what's going on? You sound... I'm stuck, I interrupted, my voice shaking. I don't know where I am. The forest. It's changing. The path is gone. Take a breath, Rachel said, her voice calm but tinged with concern. Where are you? I don't know, I admitted, my heart racing. I followed the trail, but it disappeared. I'm in a clearing with shoes, children's shoes. There was a long pause on the other end, and when Rachel spoke again, her voice was lower, almost a whisper. Get out of there, Sam. Whatever you do, don't stay in that clearing. I'm trying, I said, my throat tight. But the path, it's gone. Just stay calm, Rachel said, her voice steady. Try to retrace your steps. Focus on getting back to the station. I'll stay on the radio with you. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Rachel was right. I needed to stay calm, to focus. I turned away from the clearing, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and started walking. But no matter which direction I went, no matter how far I walked, I always ended up back at the same spot. The clearing with the shoes. The wind howled through the trees as I stood there, my legs trembling from exhaustion. The forest was playing tricks on me, leading me in circles, keeping me trapped in this nightmare. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. My mind was starting to fray, the edges of reality blurring as the oppressive silence pressed down on me. I sat down on the edge of the clearing, leaning my back against one of the trees, trying to catch my breath. The shoes lay scattered around me, silent and unmoving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, mocking me. Rachel, I whispered into the radio, my voice barely audible. I can't get out. Rachel's voice crackled through the static. Sam, listen to me. You need to keep moving. You can't stay in that clearing. I closed my eyes, trying to gather the strength to stand up. But before I could move, I heard it. Laughter. Faint at first, but growing louder, closer. The same high-pitched giggle I'd heard before, echoing through the trees like the wind. My heart skipped a beat, and I scrambled to my feet, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The laughter continued, circling the clearing, but there was no one there, no children, no figures. Just the endless expanse of trees, swaying in the cold wind. I backed away, my hands shaking, and stumbled toward the far end of the clearing. I didn't know where I was going anymore, but I couldn't stay here. And then, as suddenly as it had disappeared, the path reappeared. I don't remember how I made it back to the ranger station that night. I must have walked for hours, stumbling through the woods in a daze, guided by nothing more than sheer instinct. When I finally reached the cabin, I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The forest was silent again, the laughter gone, but I could still feel it, the eyes watching me from the trees, waiting for me to let my guard down. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat by the window, staring out into the darkness, waiting for the forest to make its next move. I had reached my limit. The days in Pine Hollow had blurred into an oppressive fog of strange carvings, eerie laughter, and unsettling encounters. My sleep was stolen by the constant feeling of being watched, by the whispers that crawled through the trees at night, and by the nightmares that took hold whenever I managed to close my eyes. I told myself I was going to leave, that I would abandon my post at the station, report what I'd seen, and never return. But something kept me tethered here, as though the forest wouldn't let me go until it was finished with me. That night, I sat in the ranger station, the radio silent, the cold creeping in through the walls. My mind was running in circles, replaying every strange event, every haunting sound. The photograph of me standing with those children, the children who had vanished over a century ago, sat on the desk in front of me. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. Was it really me in that photograph? How could it be? Then I started to hear knocking. It was soft at first, just a rhythmic tapping at the door, like a child asking to be let in. I had ignored it, too afraid of what I'd find on the other side. But then the knocking moved, to the windows, to the roof, to the walls. It never stopped, never slowed, like something was testing me, waiting for me to crack. I gripped the edges of the desk, my knuckles white, my breath shaky. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the knocking stopped. For a moment, I thought the silence was worse than the knocking. It pressed down on me, heavy and expectant, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I stood up from the desk and crossed the room to the window, peering out into the clearing. The trees loomed in the darkness, their branches twisted and skeletal under the pale light of the moon. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. The oppressive stillness was unbearable, as though I were standing in the eye of a storm. And then I saw them. The twig figures, they were hanging from the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Small human-like figures, woven from twigs and leaves, each one swaying gently in the breeze. My throat tightened as I stepped closer to the window, staring at the figures. They were crude, but each one had something disturbingly familiar. A piece of fabric, a tuft of hair, something that resembled me, my uniform, my clothing. A knot of fear twisted in my stomach. Whoever or whatever was making these things, they were watching me. They knew me. I couldn't stay inside any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and stormed out of the cabin, the door slamming shut behind me. The cold night air hit my skin, but the adrenaline kept me moving. My beam of light flickered through the trees, illuminating the figures swaying in the dark. They were close now, closer than they had ever been before. The laughter started again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was here, in the clearing with me, echoing from every direction. High-pitched, childlike giggles that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight dancing across the forest, searching for the source of the sound. Then I saw them, the children. They were standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, their pale faces illuminated by the moonlight. There were 5 of them, just like in the photograph. They wore old-fashioned clothes, dirty and tattered, their skin as pale as the moon. And their eyes were black voids, featureless and empty. They didn't move, they just stood there, watching me, their faces devoid of any emotion. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands shaking as I slowly raised the flashlight toward them. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The children didn't respond. They just stared at me with those blank, empty eyes, their small hands hanging limply at their sides. Then, in unison, they took a step forward. My flashlight flickered, the beam sputtering as the children moved closer, their footsteps eerily silent in the cold grass. I backed away, my throat tight with fear, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. Something about them was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. These weren't living children. They were something else, something ancient. "Stay back," I croaked, my voice cracking with terror. But the children didn't listen. They took another step forward. their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on me. I stumbled, tripping over a root, and fell hard onto my back. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the clearing, its beam flickering out. Darkness swallowed the clearing. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding, my eyes wide with panic. The laughter surrounded me now, closer than ever, wrapping itself around me like a noose. "Come play with us, Sam," one of the children whispered, the voice soft. I couldn't tell where the voice was coming from. It echoed in my head, in the trees, in the air around me. I backed away, my hands trembling. "No, stay away from me." But the children didn't stop. They kept advancing, their black eyes fixed on mine, their pale faces twisting in the shadows. I turned and ran. I don't know how I managed to get out of Pine Hollow that night. I ran blindly through the trees, the forest shifting and bending around me like it was trying to trap me. But somehow, I made it back to the trail. Somehow I found my way out. When I reached the edge of the hollow, I didn't stop running. I ran until the sun broke over the horizon, until I could see the distant outline of the town. My body was shaking with exhaustion, my mind reeling from the terror of what I'd seen. I stumbled into Fairview, disheveled and barely able to speak. I tried to tell them. I tried to warn them about the children, about the hollow, about the things that had been watching me. But no one believed me. The authorities dismissed my claims, chalking it up to stress, isolation, or even hallucinations. They took my report, but did nothing. They didn't care. To them, Pine Hollow was just another creepy legend. The locals shrugged it off, treating the stories like old folklore, not reality. Rachel tried to comfort me, but I could see it in her eyes. She didn't fully believe me either. How could she? How could anyone? The next morning, I was standing outside the ranger station, my hands gripping the railing of the porch, staring out into the park. That's when I saw them. A group of hikers, 5 or 6 of them, laughing and chatting as they prepared to set off on the trails. They were headed toward Pine Hollow, the same place I had just barely escaped from. I wanted to stop them. I wanted to run over and grab them by the shoulders, to shake them, to scream at them not to go into those woods. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed, frozen in place as I watched them disappear into the trees, oblivious to the danger they were walking into. As they vanished into the forest, I heard it again, the soft, familiar sound of children laughing, drifting on the wind. And I knew the cycle was beginning again.